So Tom Brady apparently has been absolutely influencing the Las Vegas Raiders' decisions. And one of the reports we just got earlier today is kind of telling, if you guys ask me, right? And it's telling because of the fact that in this article is basically putting it out there that the Raiders were not 100% certain if they wanted to fire both Antonio Pierce and Tom Telesco. Apparently, Mark Davis has some reservations about letting those two guys go. Maybe he wanted the Raiders to be a little bit consistent as we kind of go forward. And apparently, Tom Brady's the guy that pushed Mark Davis into firing both of these guys. This report comes out from Vincent Bonsignore, who said, this is Tom Brady's show now. Brady is influencing the Raiders coach and general manager search. He put it in his article saying the following, and I quote, as recently as last week, there was a feeling inside the team's headquarters that owner Mark Davis would give AP as well as Telesco another year to right the ship. Davis had reservations about moving on from the two after their first full season in charge, even if they posted a 4-13 record. But Tom Brady, who purchased the Raiders in October, felt a total reset was needed. He nudged Davis into firing Telesco and Pierce and is expected to lead the charge when it comes to finding the replacements. This is the Tom Brady show now. A person with knowledge of the situation told the Review Journal. To me, that's very, very, very interesting, right? Because Mark Davis is basically allowing Tom Brady to decide what the Raiders should and should not do. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing because Tom Brady is obviously a very smart person. He's a very good quarterback. He understands the game. He knows, what it takes to win because he won so many rings. But it was interesting to me when we got the news that Tom Telesco was fired. Or I'll be the first to tell you guys. I didn't necessarily agree with it. I felt like Tom Telesco was a solid general manager who did a really, really good job for the Raiders when it came to not only drafting, right, but like the common sense free agency decisions made a ton of sense, right? Like, generally you don't build through free agency, but you can bring in impact players through free agency, right? So like you can get an offensive tackle or a defensive lineman, right? Or a corner, right? If it's a really good corner. Those three positions make sense through free agency. And, Tom Telesco did a great job bringing in Christian Wilkins this past offseason. Wilkins one of the best defensive tackles in the NFL. And more than that, the guy got a superstar tight end. He got a superstar center. To me, Tom Telesco crushed his very first year with the Raiders. Now, some people might say, hey, we didn't win games and he signed Gardner Minshew. In the NFL, you can't win a Super Bowl in the first year. You got to build towards it, right? You got to make sure the coaching staff is right. You got to make sure that the guys you're bringing in are right. The salary cap has to be managed. There's so many different elements with it. It's almost impossible in year one to win a Super Bowl. It just isn't really realistic. And I felt like for what Tom Telesco kind of walked into with, Josh McDaniels and Dave Ziegler ultimately wasting a ton of draft picks and not really improving the team, he did a really good job in his first year. Now, AP, on the other hand, I never really agreed with hiring. So I think that was the right decision. But, firing Tom Telesco, I feel like was not necessarily the right decision. But I do understand it, right? And I kind of want to just talk about in this video the impacts that Brady has, right? If you really think about it, not only was Mark Davis not 100% sure, but Tom Brady essentially pushed Mark Davis into making this decision. Now, we still need a general manager, right? Tom Brady, although he's helping with, pushing to fire guys and potentially bringing other guys in, Tom Brady's not going to run the day-to-day stuff for the Raiders. We're still going to have to go out there and actually hire a general manager, right? We're still going to have to go out there and figure out who's going to be paired up with who. Obviously, the idea with firing Tom Telesco was that we're telling Ben Johnson that, hey, you're essentially going to end up being paired up if you take the Raiders' job with whatever general manager that might make sense. The Detroit Lions assistant general right now is Ray Agnew. Ben Johnson is obviously familiar with him, so if Ben Johnson takes the job with the Raiders, Ray Agnew would also be paired up and brought in with him, and that kind of be the idea for the Raiders as we go forward. But I find it interesting that Tom Brady's influence with the Raiders is kind of where it's at, where he's basically telling Mark Davis, let's fire these guys and let's reset, right? And the reset part of it is kind of the interesting part of it, right? A reset for the Raiders is kind of needed. And I'm not mad at it. I don't disagree necessarily if you land exactly who you're kind of targeting. In fact, Albert Breer put this article out there as well. And in this article, he also kind of puts it out there that the Raiders were not on Ben Johnson's radar at all. And that, without Tom Brady, we would have never landed that interview with Ben Johnson. Apparently, Albert Breer saying that Tom Brady's presence in Las Vegas shouldn't be ignored. The smoking gun, Ben Johnson's candidacy. He said that Ben Johnson's initial plan was to take 3 interviews with the Bears, the Jags, and the Patriots. But Brady's sell job through intermediaries made the difference. To me, that's interesting, right? Because Ben Johnson, if I remember correctly, had put it out there, and he didn't put it out there. I think it was Adam Schefter that put it out there, that Ben Johnson is not going to interview with anyone unless he himself knows that I'm going to take that job, right? Essentially, Ben Johnson put it out there that, hey, if I want the Bears job, that's the one and only job I will interview for because I'm taking that job, essentially, right? And that was kind of what Adam Schefter had said. And for the Raiders to be able to land an interview with Ben Johnson, to me, means that he's at least considering the Raiders in some fashion, right? And again, I think the Raiders do have one thing kind of going for them that both the Bears and the Jags don't. Bears have Ryan Poles as their general manager, and the Jags have Trent Baalke as their general manager. And those two guys are going to stay with those two teams. Those two teams are not moving off of those guys. So for Ben Johnson, if he takes either of those two jobs, he's not familiar with either of those general managers as opposed to the Raiders job. If Ben Johnson comes here, we're also going to end up hiring a guy he's familiar with, right? It's going to be a guy that he's worked with. It's a guy that will actually value his opinion and kind of value what he has to say about roster building and kind of constructing the roster. To me, I actually agree with Tom Brady if you're able to land Ben Johnson and kind of taking that approach, because it's just another selling point at the end of the day, right? I also do want to talk a little bit about some of the coaches that the Raiders are potentially bringing in. It was reported earlier that the Denver Broncos defensive coordinator Ben Joseph is set to interview for the Las Vegas Raiders head coaching job. Now, some people said, hey, this is one of those Rooney Rule type of interviews. The Raiders aren't actually interested in Ben Joseph. I disagree with that, first and foremost. I think Robert Saleh hits that criteria for the Rooney Rule, and we already had in place an interview with Robert Saleh in the past. So we didn't have to if that was the only criteria the Raiders are trying to check here. But Vance Joseph is actually a good general manager. I'm sorry, he's actually a good defensive coordinator, right? Now, he filled as a head coach in the past. I think he was with the Denver Broncos as well at that time, but he's a good defensive coordinator. He knows how to run schemes. He knows how to run a good defense, and I think it's a part of why the Broncos have had success. But I do also want to talk a little bit about a trend that I actually kind of just saw, and it's kind of interesting if you think about the guys that are kind of on this list. So these are the coaches that the Raiders have shown interest in, have set up an interview with, or have interviewed, or are requesting an interview, right? So these are guys that the Raiders have basically reached out to. And what's interesting is there's 7 names on this list, and of the 7, 5 are defensive guys. That's kind of interesting, right? 5 of these 7 guys right here are defensive guys. And it's kind of interesting because if I'm the one hiring, I'm hiring an offensive guy, right? There's no question about it. To me, you can always replace guys to run defenses, and you can always find guys that are going to be good at running defenses, but finding guys that run great offenses is kind of hard, right? Because you get like 4 coaches that run phenomenal offenses, different caliber of play calling. And then you get the other guys that are kind of all about the same, right? It's like the Arthur Smiths of the world, the Josh McDaniels of the world. They're good, but they're not great, right? And I think when you have those guys that are absolutely great, the Sean McVays, the Kyle Shanahans, when you get those type of guys, I think that actually makes a huge difference. And for the Raiders, it looks like we might be going the defensive approach, right? And more than that, so these are the 7 guys we've actually interviewed or are interviewing. There was an 8th as well that was on the list. Apparently, Mike Vrabel had a clear message for Tom Brady before he ultimately picked the Patriots, and that message was that, hey, I'm taking the Patriots job, so I am not interested in interviewing for the Raiders. Yes, this is a real report that's been put out there. I'm not exactly sure who it was that put this report out there. I know CBS News is quoting what was kind of said, but basically what CBS News is saying is that Mike Vrabel basically told Tom Brady, when Tom Brady reached out and said, we want to interview for the job, Mike Vrabel basically said that I'm taking the Patriots job, so I'm not going to interview for the Raiders job, right? So to me, the Raiders have now at least tried to reach out to 8 guys. 6 of them are defensive coaches, right? So again, it's just really, really interesting to me, right? And here's the guys, right? So Ben Johnson's the offensive coordinator of the Lions. Aaron Glenn is the Detroit Lions defensive coordinator. Steve Spagnuolo is the Kansas City Chiefs defensive coordinator. Todd Monken is the Baltimore Ravens offensive coordinator. Robert Saleh is with the Jets. He's a defensive guy. Pete Carroll is also a defensive guy. Although he may not have called defensive plays over the past couple of years with the Seahawks, historically speaking, Pete Carroll's always ran the defense, right? He's always kind of put that cover three defense in, right? And then, of course, Van Joseph's the final guy, and then Mike Vrabel's also a defensive guy. I guess he'd be the final guy as well. So, again, it's interesting to me that the Raiders are taking the approach where they're bringing in so many defensive guys. Now, maybe that's also because of the fact that, the Buccaneers had a playoff game just yesterday, so maybe we weren't able to reach out to their offensive coordinator and bring him in. Maybe there's another team out there that the Raiders might be interested in, right? Where maybe that team's in the playoffs, so we couldn't actually reach out to them. Maybe it's Texans, right? Maybe it was their offensive coordinator in Bobby Slowick. So I don't really know what's going to happen with the Raiders, right? But I do think this is a great time to really be bought in, right, to this team, right? Really be bought in to what the Raiders are kind of building, because if the Raiders are able to get a good general manager, if they're able to get a good head coach, this team will have success, right? And it always comes down to those two things. And I'll take you guys back just a couple years, when the Miami Dolphins hired Mike McDaniel, people were like, can this guy even be a good coach? Is he any good? Are they going to have any success? And he's been there, I believe, for 2 or 3 years, and he's been a pretty good head coach, right? And a part of why he's good is because of the fact that the Miami Dolphins have a good offense. Now, of course, I think they have a terrible quarterback in Tua Tagovailoa. I think the sooner they move off of Tua and get a different quarterback, the sooner Mike McDaniel will be able to have success. But as long as Mike McDaniel is with the Miami Dolphins, they'll have a top 10 offense every single year, right? You go back to Sean McVay, and when he took the job, you knew Sean McVay was a special coach as he kind of came in. And as the Rams hired him and you saw that this guy was the real deal, the Rams are good every year now at this point. And the Rams can change quarterbacks. They can lose their best offensive lineman. They can lose their Hall of Fame defensive tackle. None of that matters because they have Sean McVay. The Niners have Kyle Shanahan. Although you might have 1 or 2 off years, for the most part, as long as the team is built properly, as long as the general manager is doing their job, which I think for the Niners hasn't really been doing that good of a job, you'll always be good. You'll always have success, right? So I think for the Raiders, if you hire a good coach, you'll have success. And I think Ben Johnson's the guy you got to be able to hire. I think he's the one guy that can be a difference maker. I would still hire Bobby Slowick as well if the Raiders can. Todd Monken, I'm not 100% sold on him as an offensive coordinator, but he did do a really good job. Lamar Jackson had arguably his best year of his career this year as well. So maybe you hire him, but I'm definitely considering going with an offensive coordinator and making him the head coach as opposed to the guy on the defensive side. Because similar to Antonio Pierce, for a guy on the defensive side to have success, you always will have to rely on the guy calling plays on the offense side of the football. And I should just throw this out there, right? I don't want to overlook this fact, but the Raiders got to consider Patrick Graham as well as their head coach, right? I know it's not something that a lot of people have really talked about. I know it's not something that people would want to maybe even potentially bring in, but Patrick Graham's really, really well respected within the Raiders locker room. And this is not an Antonio Pierce situation at all, right? When Antonio Pierce took the job with the Raiders, he didn't call plays. He was a linebackers coach. He didn't really do anything at a top tier level in terms of play calling or scheme designing. Patrick Graham has, though, right? Patrick Graham does run and has run an elite scheme for the Raiders, and it's allowed us to have success. To me, the Raiders should consider bringing in Patrick Graham as their head coach. Now, obviously, if you hire Patrick Graham, it'd be the same thing as, hey, let's hire Steve Spagnuolo. It'd be the same thing as hiring Aaron Glenn. Of course, I don't agree with the defensive side, but if you were going to go down that route, Patrick Graham should also get a look because then you also get the same coordinator essentially for the 4th year, right? And I think that has a lot of value in itself. And with that, your head coach is essentially going to run the entire defense. I think it's a little bit easier at that point to just replace your offensive guy opposed to replacing both your offensive and defensive guy, assuming AP is your head coach, right, with Patrick Graham getting interviews. I think Patrick Graham's going to be a head coach in the next 2 years, right? I think he's a really, really good coach. And I would love for the Raiders to give this guy an opportunity. Now, I do understand with firing Tom Telesco, that's probably not going to happen at this point, right? If you were going to hire Patrick Graham as your next head coach, you would have kept Tom Telesco based off of what he had done last year. But we'll see what ends up happening. I do hope Patrick Graham does get an opportunity as a head coach. If it's not for the Raiders, I hope it's for another team. I think he's a good coach. Let me know what you guys think, man. There's a lot of interesting information that's coming out. There's reports, there's rumors. A lot of the stuff we talk about on this channel are confirmed by real insiders, right? Like Albert Barrier. I think Vincent Bonsignore is a good source as well. Some people will disagree with that. But Vincent Bonsignore is connected directly to the Raiders, right? And I'm not talking about being a beat reporter. I'm talking about real connection to the Raiders, right? The Raiders use Vincent Bonsignore as the guy to kind of put out information. So when Vincent Bonsignore is putting something out there, you got to listen to what he's ultimately saying. I want to know what you guys think, man. If you guys could pick any of these coaches, if there's one coach specifically, who's the coach you guys are picking? Let me know down in the comments below. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you guys next time with another video.